Where are you? You're on Earth. This is Earth, a floating ball in space. Where are you on Earth? Well, you're nowhere to be found just yet. Our civilization right now is thousands of years away from being formed. So I'll talk about the civilizations before us that were built and disappeared for some unknown or perhaps completely known reason. Gobekli Tepe builders. Around 9,600 BC in what's now southeastern Turkey, the people behind Gobekli Tepe started dragging multi-ton limestone pillars across the hills of Anatolia and planting them upright into shallow circular pits. These pillars were carved with animals, symbols, and abstract forms that looked more like nightmares than anything decorative. There were scorpions, snakes, vultures, headless human torsos, and weird abstract hands resting on bellies. The circles were arranged carefully, with the biggest ones having two central pillars standing taller than the others, always facing each other like they were having some kind of silent standoff. These guys didn't have pottery, farming, or permanent houses. They were hunter-gatherers, yet somehow they had the engineering skills and manpower coordination to move, shape, and place stones weighing over 10 tons. They didn't live at the site though. No houses, no graves, no burn layers, no trash pits. Just the stone circles, carefully cleaned and kept up like a sacred museum nobody dared to mess with. Whoever these people were, they kept at it for about 1600 years. They added new circles, filled in old ones, and didn't seem to build anything else. Then around 8000 BC, the builders decided to cover the entire thing up with dirt and debris. They didn't leave it to crumble. They actually filled in the circles deliberately, packing the enclosures with rubble, stone chips, and earth until everything was hidden. After that, the site was completely abandoned. The builders walked away, and no one came back for thousands of years. There's no sign of war, no signs of environmental collapse, no obvious disease, no violent destruction. They had just finished burying their own monuments and stopped using the place completely. The fact that they buried it so neatly and intentionally is part of what makes this disappearance so weird. Normally, ancient structures erode, collapse, get looted, or repurposed. That's how people usually leave things behind. The Gobekli Tepe people did the opposite. They protected the site by sealing it, and since they left no writing, no clues, and no nearby cities, there's nothing to say why. The site itself is loaded with religious or spiritual iconography, but no one can agree if it was a temple, an initiation space, an astronomical marker, or a place to get high and talk to spirits. Nabta Playa. Back when the Sahara wasn't just endless sand but an actual green savanna with lakes, grasslands, and seasonal rainfall, a group of cattle herders set up shop around a dried lake basin now called Nabta Playa. They showed up around 7500 BC, dragging along domesticated cattle, pottery, and some early farming skills. Over the next few thousand years, these people, who probably spent more time staring at the sky than necessary, started building one of the oldest known astronomical sites in the world. They dragged big stones across the desert, then arranged them in precise circular formations. One of those circles, standing stones included, lines up with the summer solstice sunrise. They also carved out stone-lined ceremonial chambers, dug wells deep enough to reach groundwater, and set up burial areas, which based on how they're laid out, look like they were trying to impress the stars. That part's not speculation. The entire complex was laid out to mirror star patterns, especially Orion's belt. Their calendar circle came up around 4800 BC, predating Stonehenge by at least 1,000 years. They also had a thing for symmetry and direction. Most of their structures point north-south or east-west, and there are sandstone slabs set up in a way that makes it clear they weren't winging it. They understood spatial planning, had a pretty solid grasp on celestial movements, and somehow managed to do all this in the middle of nowhere without iron, wheels, or centralized power. Some burial sites had human remains accompanied by cow bones, beads, and even imported seashells from the Red Sea, which meant they were in contact with other groups miles away. Then sometime around 3400 BC they were gone. No sudden war, no invasive enemy, no obvious disaster wiped them out. The environment around Nabta Playa just stopped cooperating. Rainfall dropped off. The lakes dried up, and the savanna turned into sand dunes. Their wells probably ran dry, and the grazing lands they depended on for cattle vanished. So, they left. But where they went isn't recorded anywhere. Some suggest they moved east toward the Nile Valley. The timing lines up suspiciously well with the rise of pre-dynastic Egypt. Some of the stuff that showed up later in Egyptian culture, like cattle worship, astronomical planning, and stone structures with cosmic alignment. Catalhoyuk, one of the earliest large settlements in the world, was located in what is now south-central Turkey. It started around 7500 BC and lasted nearly 2,000 years. The people built their homes out of mud bricks, stacking them so tightly together that they had to enter through the roof. There were no streets back then, just a maze of houses connected wall to wall. Instead of doors, they used ladders to climb in and out. Inside, there were plastered walls with paintings, bull skulls, and burial sites tucked right under the floors where people slept. They didn't live far apart, or with a sense of privacy. Daily life happened shoulder to shoulder with neighbors, and everything happened inside those close quarters. Cooking? Inside. Rituals? Inside. Burying the dead? Inside. The people living there farmed, grew wheat and barley, and raised sheep and goats. They also hunted wild animals, especially deer and boar. One of their most important trades came from obsidian, a sharp black volcanic glass that they used to make tools and weapons. The stuff came from volcanic sources far from the town, which meant they were either trading or traveling. Obsidian tools from Catalhoyuk have been found in other distant sites, which shows how wide their network stretched. Inside their homes, archaeologists found figurines, murals, and shrines, pointing to religious activity or at least ritual behavior. There were no large temples or palaces, which means there probably wasn't a strict hierarchy. Everyone had about the same kind of home, and even in burials, the differences were small. What makes the ending strange is how sudden it was. Around 5650 BC, after generations of people living tightly together, farming, making tools, trading, burying their family members under their own homes, the site was abandoned or nearly emptied. There was no invasion, no signs of war, destruction, or violence. The houses weren't burned, no mass graves, no fortifications torn down. People didn't die in their homes. Instead, it looked like they left. Archaeologists found a sharp drop in the number of people living there, and eventually, the place stopped being used entirely. One possible reason is a change in climate. Environmental records show some regional changes around that time that could have made farming harder. Drier conditions or colder winters might have pushed people to move somewhere else. Vinca civilization. The Vinca civilization, also known as the Vinca culture, showed up around 5500 BC in the Danube Valley, mostly in what's now Serbia and nearby areas. Archaeologists found evidence that they had actual large villages, laid out with proper planning, long before urban planning was even a thing. The houses were made from wood and wattle and daub, often sitting on raised wooden platforms with clay floors and indoor hearths. Most settlements had hundreds of people, with some stretching out over dozens of acres, which was a big deal back then. During their time, the Vinca people worked with copper even before the official start of the Copper Age. They weren't mass-producing weapons or anything, but they clearly understood how to smelt and shape metal for tools and ornaments, which already put them in a whole other league from their neighbors. Their pottery was high quality and decorated with complex geometric patterns. But the most bizarre thing they left behind were these clay figurines and carved symbols that have driven archaeologists nuts for decades. The figurines looked abstract or alien-like, and the symbols that were scratched into pottery showed patterns that some researchers think might be a form of proto-writing. Trade was a big part of their system. Vinca communities were swapping goods like obsidian, seashells, and copper over long distances. They were part of a broader network across southeastern Europe. Archaeological digs like the one in Vincabello, Bordeaux, revealed that people in this area lived in houses bigger than some modern apartments, storing surplus grain, raising livestock, and maintaining fairly complex social systems. Then, somewhere around 4500 BC, everything stopped. These big settlements were suddenly left empty. Tools and pottery were left behind. There were no signs of war or burning, no massive graves full of bodies, and no writing or oral record explaining where everyone went. Some archaeologists think the climate pushed people out as farming conditions got worse. Jiroft civilization. The first time anyone took the Jiroft civilization seriously was in the early 2000s, when local farmers near the Halil River in southeastern Iran started digging up weirdly intricate artifacts made of chlorite stone. Things like bowls, cups, animal figures, and other stuff way too advanced for a bunch of hill people with shovels. Archaeologists like Yusef Majidzadeh rolled in after that and realized they were looking at a city older than most people thought Iran could manage. This site, near the modern town of Jiroft, held ruins from around 3000 BC that showed signs of urban planning, writing systems, and monumental architecture. At the time, the history books were still harping on Mesopotamia as the center of early civilization, but this place had high-end trade goods, a unique writing script that hasn't even been cracked yet, and religious relics that pointed to a society organized enough to build temples and palaces. People started throwing around the name Arata, an old Sumerian legend about a rich land full of precious goods that traded with Uruk. The economy clearly ran off trade. Artifacts found on site showed material links to Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, and even Central Asia. That meant Jiroft was in the middle of a long-distance trade web. That chlorite stone was shaped into objects with religious symbols, mythological creatures, and composite animals, which means someone had time to think up theology and not just farm barley. By around 2600 BC, the settlements around the Halil River had already grown into proper cities, with fortifications and irrigation systems, plus cemeteries stacked with luxury goods. By 2000 BC, the whole thing collapsed. No one agrees why. The Halil River may have changed course and wrecked the agricultural base. A flood could have erased entire districts. Trade routes might have moved west or south and cut off their access to luxury imports. Some archaeologists blame the Elamites from western Iran, who were already flexing on their neighbors by that point. If they marched east, they could have wiped Jiroft clean and left no one to complain. Sanxingdui civilization. In the Sichuan basin of ancient China, the Sanxingdui civilization thrived from around 1600 to 1200 BC. It stood out during the Bronze Age for producing massive bronze sculptures, intricate gold masks, tree-like ritual artifacts, and jade tools that looked nothing like anything made in Shang-era China. The city was surrounded by thick, protective walls and covered about 3 square kilometers, with its population believed to have been in the tens of thousands. The name Sanxingdui comes from the archaeological site near modern Guanghan, where in 1929 a farmer accidentally discovered jade relics. But it wasn't until 1986 that 2 major sacrificial pits were unearthed, containing bizarre and oversized bronze masks with protruding eyes, exaggerated ears, and patterns that didn't match any known Chinese motifs. Some scholars initially assumed this was a completely separate cultural group, unconnected to the Shang dynasty in the Central Plains. The large-scale bronze casting pointed to sophisticated metallurgical skills, and the lack of written records left archaeologists guessing about how a society this complex functioned, organized itself, and interacted with neighbors. The abrupt collapse of Sanxingdui around 1200 BC left behind no clear sign of war or internal rebellion. Instead, the structures were left abandoned, and the people who had built all these grand monuments just stopped living there. One working theory points to a strong earthquake in the region that likely triggered landslides in the nearby Longmen Mountains. Those landslides would have blocked or diverted the course of the Minjiang River, which had been the main water source for Sanxingdui. Without water, the city couldn't support farming, rituals, or daily life, forcing the population to move. Not long after Sanxingdui was left behind, a new settlement appeared about 40 kilometers away. It was named Jinsha, and the material culture there, especially the bronze, jade, and gold artifacts, looked almost identical to what was found at Sanxingdui. The same religious symbols, stylistic designs, and ritual practices showed up again in this new city, hinting that the people from Sanxingdui didn't vanish completely but relocated and rebuilt. Tartesos. Tartesos was a coastal civilization sitting in what's now southern Spain, around the Guadalquivir River basin. It showed up in Greek and Phoenician writings as early as the 1st millennium BC, described as wealthy, mysterious, and kind of a big deal in the metal game. These guys were loaded with silver, tin, and gold, which made their ports important for trade. Greek travelers wrote about Tartessians with admiration, mostly because they liked shiny things, and Tartessos had plenty. One of the only rulers with a name that stuck was Argentonius. The Greeks said Argentonius ruled for 80 years, which is either a wild exaggeration or the man discovered the earliest Mediterranean version of Botox. During his time, Argentonius supposedly welcomed Greek traders and gave them silver. After Argentonius vanished from the record, Tartessos started fading fast. Around the 6th to 5th century BC, any mention of the place just drops off. No more updates from the Greeks, nothing else from the Phoenicians, just silence. Whatever city center Tartessos had still hasn't been found, though archaeologists have been trying for over a century. Excavations around the lower Guadalquivir have found rich grave goods, intricate artifacts, and some architecture, but there's no solid hit that says this was Tartessos. The structures that do exist show Eastern Mediterranean influence mixed with local Iberian style, which tracks with what's been said about how they traded with both Phoenicians and Greeks. One theory about their disappearance points straight to Carthage. Carthage had a habit of bulldozing anything that got in the way of its monopoly on Mediterranean trade. Tartessos was clearly valuable and too close to the action for Carthage to ignore. Around this time, Carthaginian expansion westward was picking up, and it lines up with when Tartessos started going quiet. Some think Carthaginian fleets might have taken out Tartessian ports to stop them from working with rivals like the Greeks. Without those ports and trade routes, whatever central power Tartessos had would have collapsed fast. No trade, no wealth, no power. Once the coast was lost, inland influence crumbled right behind it. Teotihuacan. Teotihuacan started growing sometime around the 1st century AD in the highlands of central Mexico. The full name is unknown, but centuries later, the Aztecs called it Teotihuacan, meaning the place where gods were made. By around 100 AD, the city already had carefully planned grid streets, wide avenues, and 2 giant pyramids, the Pyramid of the Sun and the Pyramid of the Moon. These massive structures sat on a long stretch called the Avenue of the Dead. There were markets, apartment compounds, temples, plazas, drainage systems, and murals. A huge part of the population lived in dense multi-family stone housing complexes, and there's evidence of workshops for pottery, obsidian tools, and other crafts. Teotihuacan was probably ruled by a centralized authority, but no names of rulers or dynasties have ever been found. No royal tombs either. Whoever was in charge kept their personal identity out of the art and monuments. The elite lived in palatial complexes near the pyramids. There were trade links going far into Mesoamerica. Murals, artifacts, and architecture show connections with places like the Maya lowlands, Oaxaca, and the Gulf Coast. People from those regions even lived in separate neighborhoods within Teotihuacan. Then around 550 AD, the central part of the city, the one where the elite lived, was burned. Temples and administrative buildings were either wrecked or torched. Walls were smashed, altars were broken, and murals were scraped off. There's no clear record of who did it. Some think it was a sudden attack by outsiders, but there's no direct evidence of a foreign invasion. Others believe it was an uprising from inside the city. Years of bad harvests, especially with the region's dependence on rain-fed agriculture, probably pushed people over the edge. A long period of drought is recorded in environmental studies around the same time, which would have meant food shortages and chaos. If the ruling class had been hoarding resources or failed to respond, it wouldn't have taken much for angry commoners or rival factions to snap and burn the place down. After the destruction, the population shrank fast. Most of the city was abandoned. A few people kept living in the outskirts for a while, but the city center never recovered. Nazca. The Nazca civilization showed up around 100 BC on the southern coast of what is now Peru. These people lived in one of the driest deserts on Earth and still managed to grow food by digging out a system of underground aqueducts called puquios. They used these channels to pull groundwater up to the surface and irrigate crops like maize, beans, and squash. This setup let them build villages and sustain a population in a region where rain barely showed up. They also built ceremonial centers and practiced complex rituals that included human and animal sacrifices. The dead were buried with textiles, tools, and sometimes entire sacrificed animals. Their art showed gods with big eyes, fierce expressions, and animals like monkeys and birds. They made pottery with crazy vivid colors and patterns, and they wore intricate clothes dyed with cochineal and other bright pigments. They're most famous for the Nazca lines, which are massive geoglyphs carved into the desert floor. These figures stretched for hundreds of feet across the dry plains. There were hundreds of them, including animals like hummingbirds, whales, and spiders, plus geometric shapes and straight lines that ran for miles. And yet they managed it without drones, planes, or any hill tall enough to see the whole thing. The point of these lines isn't fully clear. Some think they were religious offerings meant to be seen by sky gods. They didn't leave written records, so most of what people know about them comes from their architecture, their burials, and what's been dug up. Their cities weren't built on a massive scale, but they had centralized areas for rituals and community work, and it all worked for a few centuries. But by around 600 AD, towns got abandoned. Their irrigation systems stopped working, people moved away or just disappeared altogether. Scientists think environmental disaster is what hit them. Ice core and sediment data show a cycle of mega floods followed by long droughts. Normally, the puquios could have handled this, but there's a catch. At some point, the Nazca started chopping down huge numbers of huarango trees to clear space for farmland. These trees were key to keeping the soil stable and holding moisture in the ground. Once those were gone, the soil turned brittle. The wind blew the top layer away, and the floods from El Niño events destroyed what little was left of their irrigation system. Without water and crops, their communities couldn't survive. There's no sign of a war wiping them out, no major invasion. Just people trying to survive in a desert, messing with the one system that let them do it, and then getting crushed when the weather turned on them. That's when the Nazca culture stopped showing up in the archaeological record, and the area stayed quiet for centuries. Hohokam. The Hohokam started in the Arizona desert around 1 AD, and somehow made it work in a place that should have been completely useless for farming. They built a crazy network of irrigation canals using just stone tools and manpower. These canals were deep and wide enough to move water from the Salt and Gila rivers straight into the desert, turning bone-dry land into farmland that could handle corn, beans, squash, and cotton. They kept those fields going for generations. Their biggest villages, like Snaketown, had plazas, ball courts, and structured neighborhoods that showed they were organized. And not in a casual, everyone does what they want way. There were clear signs of planning, social roles, and some kind of leadership system keeping things running. By around 1350, the canals were getting harder to maintain, and floods messed them up more than once. Then came the droughts, as in multiple years of terrible crop seasons, and if that wasn't enough, the constant watering had turned the soil salty. That made farming a nightmare. Crop yields dropped, and when food got tight, cooperation started breaking down. There's physical evidence showing people started leaving some villages behind and moving into others, which usually doesn't happen unless people are stressed, mad, or scared. Excavations show burned buildings and broken pottery, which might mean people weren't leaving peacefully. Some researchers think outside groups might have shown up, possibly leading to fights over land and resources. Others think it was more about the people already there losing patience with leadership or each other and turning on themselves. Either way, it wasn't good. By around 1450, the Hohokam civilization became so uncivilized that civilization is not a term for them anymore. The irrigation systems were clogged up and crumbling. The big village sites like Snaketown were empty, and whatever central system kept things working had disappeared. When Spanish explorers came through the area a century or two later, the canal systems were still there, but nobody was using them the same way. The people living there by that point, mainly smaller Tohono O'odham and Pueblo groups, might have been related to the Hohokam, but they weren't rebuilding the cities or restarting the canals. The culture that pulled water through the desert, fed massive communities, and built sports arenas in the sand just stopped. No single disaster took them out. It was a combination of environmental luck, soil turning useless, leadership falling apart, and probably people being people. So thank goodness that the civilizations today all around the world became so interconnected when it did. I guess that comes with the exception of some groups of people that don't want to be disturbed at all, like the Sentinelese ones, but my point remains, if it weren't for us being completely interconnected with one another, I guess we'd still have civilizations popping up and dying globally. See y'all.